Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
So 5 years ago, I was working for a company that had just been acquired, wireless generation, just been acquired by a larger company, and we had a lot of capital to do big things. And we just, one of the things, since I had the background from a long time ago in games, were to try educational games for middle school kids. And I had been a gamer my whole life, but hadn't really followed educational games. So the first thing I did is went around and asked everyone, so what are the best educational games for middle school kids? And I got one answer from everybody, which was, oh, well, there's Oregon Trail. And then there would be a long pause. And then I went and looked in Oregon Trail. Well, okay, that was made in 1971. So surely there's something since then that is as good or better. And even Oregon Trail, I went back and looked. It was sort of interesting for 1971, but I would not something you would model a great game after now. And I was astonished that pretty much everything from the past 20 years was just awful. I mean, really, for younger kids, a different situation. And so before actually making any investments or figuring out what to do, spent a long time, 4 to 6 months, going around talking to people. Well, how is it that so many people, well-intentioned, have worked so hard for so long with so little success? And this is a game from 20 years ago, Microsoft Bob Geo Safari, and I'm going to pick it as the kind of platonic ideal of the bad educational game for middle school kids. It's a little unfair to pick a game from 20 years ago, but the 5 things I'm going to talk about very briefly about this game are just kind of like the 5 things that I saw going wrong over and over and over again. And it's just easy with this game. You can just take any screenshot from the game, and it's, they're pretty obvious. So the first is Will Wright once said that games are about interesting choices. So the choices in this game are really not at all meaningful or interesting. Basically, try the quiz questions you missed, learn more about the quiz, begin a different quiz, begin this quiz again. Those are basically your choices. The best choice that is, and visually the most interesting, you can't quite see it on the screen, is on the lower right, the exit button. And this is actually an early example of a freemium game. There's a number you can call periodically in the game to order, you call Microsoft and they will send you expansion packs, but the expansion packs are just more quizzes. So that's first thing. Second thing is there's almost nothing social about this game. There is a leaderboard at the bottom, but it's only a leaderboard for the version of the game on your computer, so presumably you can only compete against your parents or siblings. Not much fun if you're a middle school kid. The third thing is that in this kind of game, failure is nothing more than a lack of success. If you don't succeed at at a particular quiz, or you're less than 100%, all that is a sign that you should keep trying until you finish it, but there's nothing additional that happens. Fourth thing is, this is the kind of trade term for chocolate-covered broccoli, just meaning that there's no intrinsic relationship between the game-year parts of the game and the learning. So why is there an elephant trying to get you to do all this stuff when presumably on safaris elephants don't usually fare very well? Would the game be any different if it were a Martian? Not really. And the last thing is, it's obvious, Microsoft Bob. This is a game which feels like it was made by a corporation, not by some particular game designer. So those are the 5 things I want to talk about. And the reason I picked these 5 are these are things, if you're doing games for younger kids, you can get away with not doing all of them well. I think if you get all 5 of them wrong, you're probably in trouble for any audience. But these are the 5, unless you get close to all 5 right. And with Adolescents, I think your chances of success are very small. And I want to say some reasons why. Well, first of all, let's just think about adolescent psychology. So how do adolescents respond to lack of choices? I mean, that's kind of the first thing you have to think about when you're doing games for adolescents, is that, and there's a lot of research to support this, the thing they find most demotivating is the sense of being controlled. Right, and so everything in your game, and the opposite of feeling controlled is feeling like you have meaningful choices. And for educational games, there are some particular ways about sort of game mechanics or choices of ways of giving kids choices I think are particularly important, because any game, typically an educational game, you're not only asking kids to do some form of high cognitive task, it's at its heart a high cognitive task similar to the ones they're doing in school. And school for kids, there's the phrase we hear over and over again in playtesting, if something smells like school, that's the kiss of death, because for this generation of kids, as previous, school is one of their kind of archetypal experiences of feeling controlled. So you need to get, in the game, you need to get things right that school does not get right. So one of them is choices of strategies. You want to always try to give the player more than one way to solve a particular challenge. Otherwise, it just feels like you're trying to give the answer the teacher wants rather than just an answer which works in the world. And then even better, there are a range of ways of giving the players choices of which problems to solve, or at least the order. So the simplest one, even if you're doing a very small game, a crossword puzzle is an example of this, is you get to choose the order of which problems you solve. Then sort of going up in ambition, there's a kind of quest structure where you have a series of selection of defined problems and can choose which ones to solve. And the commercial game space Skyrim is kind of the ultimate example of this. I mean, in Skyrim, the quests are all not that different from each other, but there's so many of them, at least you feel like you have that kind of choice. And the most ambitious and the most successful are games which enable the players to actually design their own problems or choose their own definition of success. So SimCity would be a great example of that. So that's one. Number two is, social is important, right? Now that's, to anyone who works with games, that's kind of obvious, right? But there's actually 30 years of research now to show just how important it is. On the engagement side, there's the research which started at the University of Rochester, goes under the rubric of self-determination theory. It's a great book by Scott Rigby, who talks a lot at these conferences, and Richard Ryan, about how one of the most predictive features of whether someone will continue to play a game or actually continue to persist in a task in school beyond, over the medium term, is the extent to which they feel like they're related to other people or to non-player characters in the game. But it's also true on the learning side. There's a whole set of scholarships started by James Paul G. About affinity spaces, about how the learning, and even in single-player games, how the learning mostly happens in the social spaces around the games. And so even if you have a single-player game, you can kind of give it a huge boost in terms of the amount of hard thinking that kids and problem solving that kids do around the game by creating social spaces around your game. But those are for any age. For adolescents, you really want to think about what are the social patterns that adolescents have which are different from other age groups. And it is different. There's actually surprisingly little written about this in regard to games. The one really useful book or research that I found is Mizuko Ito and some other scholars from UC Irvine did a great collection of essays and research based on research of, they're ethnographers. So they just spent a lot of time watching how kids behave in social groups, both in Japan and in the United States, rather like a naturalist might observe wild animals. And there's a kind of we saw it also when we've worked with thousands of kids now and adolescents in playtesting. There's a kind of pack pattern which is quite common, which is this hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, which is so we have our playtesting space, quite a bit of space, and at least half of it is actually not where we do playtesting, but it's just sort of bean bags and other places where the kids can come and mill around. There's food, they can just do whatever in a kind of aimless grazing way, and we need to you need to let them do that. And then there's kind of a second phase where they start to up the intensity and they'll pick up stuff and start to try it in a very casual way and sort of in individual small groups and not especially goal-oriented. And then if you've let them do those things without disturbing them or frightening them, then they will kind of go into this mode of geeking out, where, geeking in the sense of really intensively engaging with something and trying to figure out how it works and how to do it. And for this kind of teen behavior, social behavior, mobile devices turn out to be sort of an essential, I guess, accessory is the best way to think about it. I don't know, you recognize the screenshot from a movie which is now old called Clueless, but there's a famous scene from that movie where two teenagers are talking to each other over the cell phone even though they're walking down the hall with each other. And that's kind of, I haven't seen exactly that behavior, but it is the kind of mobile devices for kids, part of the way they use them at this age are really in that kind of accessory. It's just the thing you always have with you as you're doing all these things. You don't even have to worry about exactly, it's just sort of, you don't think about how you're doing it. It's just part of your life that way. And there's almost nothing else that works that way. So for us, we made the early decision that everything we did is for mobile. And I think we're still unique in the extent of doing learning games on mobile for this age group at the level that we're doing it. So for the kind of younger end of this spectrum, there's one social mechanic which has been the dominant one for the past 40 years, which is the creating and sharing user-generated content. Go from Dungeons and Dragons to, when we started out, the big one was Little Big Planet, to now Minecraft. And one of the things about that is in and around that mechanic, there are a lot of different ways to be social. So there's the sort of creating and sharing within the game. There's you see with Minecraft, the YouTube thing, which is sort of using other social channels to share both stuff you've made in the game, but also things like fan fiction, which especially for girls, adolescent girls, is a huge thing. There's the kind of rating and reviewing. One of the kind of killer features of the Little Big Planet online community was you could heart things that other levels of the game that other players had made. And then there's the documentary stuff, live streaming. And I think this is so powerful for this age group because it combines the idea of open-ended rather than predefined choices. So you sort of can choose to do almost anything, or it feels that way, with a social element where you also have choices about how to be social, whether to be the dungeon master or the player, the viewer of the Minecraft video, or just the creator of it. And then this is one that I remember being surprised by how consistent the answers were from kids. When we would ask kids, give them a game. The first thing is, any game you give to a kid in this age group, either the first or the second question, even if you gave them solitaire, the first or second question they would ask would be, how can I play this with my friends? But then the next question we would ask them is, well, if you could play this game with anybody, who would you want to play it with? And then the interesting thing, it could be an inner city 8th grader from New Haven to somebody from a suburban school district somewhere else. You'd not only get the same answer, but you could see the sort of same thought process going through their head as they tried to answer the question. They'd say, well, I'd play it with my friends. then kind of a pause. Well, I'd actually like to meet some new people, so maybe you'd be playing with people I don't know, like in another city. And then there'd be another pause. And then you start to see their whole body language change. They'd get kind of this dreamy look in their face. Say, I really would like to play this game with people in other countries, like in Asia or Africa. That's what I really want to do. And if you think about it for adolescents, social gaming for younger kids is largely playing in the group of people that you grew up with. It's a very safe space. You play with your family, you play with the kids in your school, and adolescence is largely about moving beyond that social group. And the exciting thing, once kids get the idea of digital, is that can enable that. One of my favorite stories recently, a 13-year-old boy who's the son of a friend of mine, he's a very good Destiny player, so he started to get into the live streaming his stuff on Destiny, but his favorite thing these days is Clash of Clans. And he's in a top-ranked clan, and he's 13 and lives in Washington, D.C. The people running his clan are two real-life Marines stationed in East Asia, right? So here you get a 13-year-old kid going to a sort of prep, private school in Washington, and he's met these people. He's gone to social events, different parts of the country, this whole circle of adults around the world who are now his real life as well as virtual friends because of this game. And he's judged, it's like that old New Yorker cartoon on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. They don't really care that he's 13, they just care that he's good at the game. Okay, so I mentioned the research shows that actually in self-determination theory what they call it is not social but relatedness. And the interesting thing is people get their needs satisfied in that way often from non-player characters in the same way they do from interactions with real people. But for adolescents that's kind of can go either way. The kind of great version of it I think of is from the Japanese game Aiko, where you're playing as a sort of tween boy and you're rescuing a somewhat older and taller girl who never talks from the castle. So it's a sort of story of boy rescues girl, has all sorts of wonderful elements to it, very evocative. The great moment in the game is the boy reaching out to the girl, they touch hands. The bad version of it, going back to Geo Bob, is there's some character in the game who's just trying to get you to do stuff in a kind of transparent way that seems like trying to be your boss. So hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? So it's almost better not to have characters than to have characters like that. Third, making failure more than lack of success. There's a great line by Jasper Jewell, who's a professor at NYU, that in good games, failure adds content. And not so good games, and in almost every educational game, the only responses to failure are try it again, or here's how you could do better, or something like that. My favorite example of this is actually not from an educational game, but was my favorite game ever. A game called Glitch by Tiny Speck, the founder of which then went on to do Slack, which you've probably heard of by now. So what happened in Glitch was when you die, because you ran out of energy or you just did something dumb, you go to hell, but hell turns out to be a really interesting place. And the first thing you do in hell is all the other people who recently died are all just kind of hanging out. So it's that kind of teenage thing. Oh, there are a bunch of people hanging out here wondering what to do. And then there's kind of the messing around stage. Well, the only thing really here to do is to squish grapes. So you go around and you do that for a while, and it makes a fun squishing sound. And then eventually when you figure, okay, I got to figure out how to get out of here, or what to do, you get to the bottom circle of hell, and there's a bar, and an interesting bartender, and you get this bottle of hell wine, and so you feel like you've accomplished something by dying, and then eventually you go back to, you get reborn. So that's kind of great. There's, going outside of gaming, there's a set of research by a woman named Carol Dweck, which has informed everything we've done about mindsets. And a lot of you are probably familiar with it. I'll just give the very short version. But she did research with a wide range of age of kids about how their own views of what intelligence is affected their academic performance. And she found, I suspect she would have found the same thing looking at adults. People just generally divide up into two groups. One group which believes that intelligence is something that's fixed and innate. There's nothing you can do about it. Either you're smart or you're not. The other group that believes intelligence is something you can cultivate. You can get smarter by working at things. And there are a whole set of associated behaviors that are correlated with which of the groups you're in. But the interesting thing from our point of view was when they tracked academic performance against those beliefs, once you adjust for everything else, it doesn't really matter until you get to 5th grade. So for the younger kids, they more or less perform the same way regardless of which group they were in. But starting in 5th grade and all the way through college, there's this huge gulf where the kids who have the growth mindset do much better in school than the kids who have the other one. And a lot of that turns out to be one of the associated behaviors is about failure. So if you're in the entity mindset, the belief that intelligence is innate, you're afraid to take intellectual risks because if you fail, it means you're stupid. If you have the growth mindset, failure is an opportunity to get better at something. It's part of the learning process. So most people who are hardcore gamers kind of understand this on some level already because no one expects to be really great at a game the first time they try it. But what we've tried to do is actually, because what she showed is that actually you can change kids' minds about this, and if you do, they actually do better in school. So one of the ways she did it, for instance, was just by giving kids information about neurobiology, just the ways in which the brain actually does physically change as a result of what you do, and then those kids who read that actually did better in school after that. So in terms of techniques that sort of how to incorporate a kind of healthy idea of failure into your games, she did research with math games that showed that math games that have kind of growth mindset incentives that reward players not just for their success, but for their effort, their use of strategy, for incremental progress. Those kids did better in the games, persisted in them for longer, and learned more from them. There's a kind of real-life parenting version of this where, in the kind of Dweck view of the world, you're never supposed to praise kids for being smart. You're supposed to praise their effort. And as a parent, I can just tell you, at least from my kind of, it's hard to do, but it is, I think, true. Non-educational games with experience point mechanics often use these kinds of things. That's kind of the version of it where anything you do, you get some experience points from trying it, even if you weren't successful. That's kind of a version of it. The bad failure technique, one that we do use sometimes, but it's dangerous with adolescents in terms of engagement, are hint systems and tutorials, because if you go too far in that direction, it starts to feel to them like they're being controlled or manipulated. So, and this is one of the differences between adults and adolescents, is that, so we tend to err, with our games, on the side of letting kids take the time to figure things out for themselves and just sort of experiment. Adults, when they sit down in the game, say, well, I'm getting frustrated with this. Why isn't there a tutorial? Why isn't there something that tells me what to do? Where's the instruction manual? And we have to sort of explain to them that not only is that not how kids want to do it, but they'll actually do better at it if we don't give them those things. This is one this is kind of something we agonized over in a kind of theological way. The first year, the biggest investment we made is in a AAA-sized game, an English language arts game world called Lexica, created by Shell Games in Pittsburgh. And before, this is in the first year before we actually made, they made any software, we thought a lot about who is the player in the game? Are they playing themselves? Is it a role-playing game? And the reason why we worried about it so much is the advantage of playing as yourself is you feel like, okay, I did this. If I succeeded in some reading or writing or hard cognitive task, then it was really me that did it. But the flip side of it is if I fail, then I failed, right? And so if I have this kind of brittle view of failure, that is a reason to stop playing, get discouraged. And so the compromise we came up with is, and we started to see some other people do this too, I don't know if it's sort of imitation or we're all just thinking alike, is the avatars in the game, you choose an avatar which represents your curiosity. So we call them curiosos. There's a group at MIT, they came up with something, Scott Osterwell, they had curiosi, and then we agonized over, well, who's correct, the Latin plural of, and we just focus grouped it, and the kids like curioso better, and that seemed to us to be the compromise of, this is some representation of you, who you are, but it's not all of who you are, so it's okay to try and fail and be someone, do things not the way you usually do them. Chocolate covered broccoli, this is just the idea that the game mechanics have kind of an arbitrary relationship to what you're trying to teach kids. So this is a famous example from a game called Times Attack, where it's a dungeon crawler, and every so often there's a multiplication or a math problem you have to solve, why there's a math problem, and the dungeon is never really explained. And the thing about this is this is, if I gave this to my 8-year-old, she would be fine with it. It's not, you can get away with it. I don't think it's great game design, but you can get away with a lot of stuff like this for younger kids, and they want it to work. They're not so wary of being manipulated. Whereas if you give this to an adolescent, they're going to see it for what it is, which is kind of this half-baked way to just try to get you to do something. And so, some of the ways that you can get around this are by just really making the game about what it is you're trying to teach them. So this is a game called SimCell, to cell biology game, and it's just a really as lifelike as we could make it experience of what it would be like if you were, wandering around and trying to do stuff inside of a human cell. And the beauty of it is this is actually what, if you had the right size microscope, what a cell would look like. This is a one commercial game that we've done so far, or all of our other games are so far just for the schools market. It's called 12 a Dozen. And as much as possible, it's a math game where the math ends up being pretty complicated. As much of the game as we could is really intimately related. It's about math. You play as a number which transforms into other numbers. The sort of interactive things in the game are all numbers or operators. The villain in the game is the largest known prime number who's trying to prevent anyone from finding a larger prime number. So it feels like you're in a kind of math world where it makes sense that you're having to do a lot of math to kind of rescue the world. But this one, I was actually, it's one of our best games. I was really hesitated when the designer pitched it to us. I was very hesitant because this easily felt like it could have, when we just got the proposal, it could have been like Times Attack. But what made it not that way was the designer is a Hungarian guy named Imre Jele, who taught himself English by watching Monty Python. And the game has a kind of crazy but quite coherent sensibility to it. So in the way that those old Monty Python cartoons did it, it kind of has its own inner logic. So of course this is the way the world works. And that brings me to my last point, which is, for adolescents more than anyone else, they care that the game seems like it was made by somebody, and they'll enjoy it and be interested much more if they can be fans of the person who made it as well as the thing itself. So examples from other media, rock music or rap music or anything like that, being a fan of the music is it's very hard to separate from being a fan of the musician. And there are two levels on which that works in games. One is, even if they don't know who made it, it feels like someone made it. And the opposite of that is the school textbook. Like your 8th grade math textbook. Do you know who wrote that, or do you imagine there's a real single person who created that? And so games which have a kind of weird sensibility to them, but it's a coherent one, that gets their attention and has a kind of credibility. And then they want to believe that there is some single person who actually made this. So whether it's, Gary Gygax and Dungeons and Dragons, or Miyamoto with all the Nintendo games, or now Notch. This is somebody, I don't know if it's Kid built, this is a kind of version of Notch in Minecraft. And so if there's a piece of advice I would give to game designers is don't hesitate to be weird. Like being weird isn't going to be a sufficient condition for succeeding at educational games for this age group, but it might be a necessary condition. So I'd love to have a conversation with whatever time we have left or questions.
Hi, you mentioned that it was very difficult to find a fun adolescent game, and that you had something from 1971 that was the only candidate.
Well, that's also educational.
Educational.
Yeah.
What about the Carmen San Diego?
Yeah, I almost included that. I mean, that's not quite 1971, but there was those games from what was the company that made all those games in that era? Those are the closest ones. Yeah, those skew a little younger than my targeting. There's I would put a plug in, not something that we've had anything to do with, but finally Zoombinis just got reissued. Fablevision did a wonderful version. So that was one of the best of that generation, but it skews a little bit younger because it does have some of the characteristics, the much better game of the Microsoft Bob. It's sort of what you're doing, but obviously it has a lot more heart to it. It has a character. There are a lot of things that get wonderfully right. I'm not sure if that game, if it were out today, would do quite as well. Whereas Zumbinis, which is for a younger, sort of is more 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, I just gave it to my kids, and they had no idea that it was an old game that had been remade, and they loved it. But so that was a simpler one to remake.
This insight was really interesting. Do you find that there's any gender preference in this age group?
So that was one of the things, and so when I first started doing this, the question that I got from skeptical adults and sort of business people was basically a version of like, will African American girls play your game? Like you'll get white boys to play it, but and both what we found and what the research shows is that actually through 8th grade that there are not meaningful distinctions across socioeconomic or gender. I mean, there are some niche things. We just saw Star Stables a little while ago, but we haven't seen with our games. If anything, the games do a little bit better with girls usually because, first because we're careful about it, but second because they actually they're more open to the idea of it being a learning game, being a good game, that it will help them do better in school is something that they're at that age more receptive to. But it's just, those categories, it's just not, we don't see it. Once you get to high school, then that's a much harder thing. Then you start to get the boys going in the Call of Duty direction, or a lot of them, and the girls going in some other direction. But I think through 8th grade, if you do a really good game and you're just sensitive to the things that might cause a boy or a girl to run away screaming, you're okay.
So you developed 20 games?
This year we published, we have a very small group internally, and then we work with independent studios around the world, as Barry said, and so we published more than 30 games this year that we have been working on. very few, all of them, the great thing when I worked as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old in a game company, one of the people who founded the company had a saying, which I later learned he got from someone else, which is, games are never finished, they're only published. Right. But with digital games, the fact that they're published shouldn't mean that you're finishing them. And one of the other things in terms of the social thing that's different now than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago is when I was that age working for a game company, it didn't help me get any social capital at school or dates or anything like that. It was not. Now, for a kid, the aspiration to be a game designer is right up there with being, center fielder for the Yankees or something like that. And in some ways even better because parents are supportive because they figure, well, you might not be a game designer, but it gets you learn how to do coding and stuff. That's great. And so we have this big portfolio of games, and we play tested with thousands of kids, and when we sort of treated them, we learned a lot from a woman at New Mexico State University who has a learning games lab called Barbara Chamberlain, who's just awesome. She has videos online, so if you Google about how to do play testing with this age group, which is its own topic, but I won't do it because you can just watch her videos. But we had this thing where, so for the big AAA game, we had a really early version of it, which had lots of things, white box and everything. So we piloted it anyway in a school in East Haven. And then about 3 months later, we kind of did an after-school thing with the kids who'd been playing the game. We asked them, and there's one kid that came in and said, "This is a terrible game," and he went on this monologue for like 5 or 7 minutes, devastatingly accurate about all the things which weren't good in the game yet. And then somebody asked him, "Hey, you know a lot about this game. How much have you been playing it?" It's like, "Well, I play it for a couple hours a day for the past few months." And it's like, "But you hate it." "Yeah, it's terrible." But what had motivated him was the idea is like, he had figured out, I'm 12 years old, and as a 12-year-old, very few adults are actually interested in your opinion about something and would actually do something based on your opinion. There's this group of people who will take this game and maybe do something differently about it if I give them feedback. And so we have this large portfolio of games, and part of it's not just the strategy for continuing to make them better, but it's also the strategy for sort of social strategy for engaging them is to keep them involved and interacting with the game designers about how do you want to see this game get better. And so we have a big enough portfolio now, it's just a question of, and then the other thing is independent studios, it's just been great, the range of different kinds of designers who are interested in doing this work. So I don't think that's not the reason the games haven't been created yet. It's just about setting up the market and the incentives to get them to do the work, and then the help with the pedagogy.
So can you address how you go about distributing these games to
well, that's a different topic, and I won't pretend that I have that one solved yet. We felt like the first, as other people have said here today, the first thing is make something which is worth distributing. We focused on the schools market, so we're in a small way. We have a lot of potentially big customers, so we're in Los Angeles public schools and Chicago public schools and New York public schools and a lot of the larger school districts in the country. And those school districts are districts that have bought our non-game products district-wide. So the hope is that, we have a small sales force, so the idea is that if you can market to large school districts, they try your product, the teachers like it, the kids like it, then you have a big customer. We're still trying to figure out, exactly what to do about consumer. That I won't pretend to have that one solved. For this age group, it's, because you really have the two audiences of trying to convince the kids that it's something that they should want, while also reaching the parents. But
hey, Justin, how's it going?
Hey.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you integrated social into the games themselves?
Yeah, so in our most ambitious games, we've this build and share thing where you give the kids the Little Big Planet was the inspiration for it. You give kids the tools to build their own levels of the game, and then share them with within a safe network. So that's for the schools market. They can share their levels with other kids in the school or the school district, and then we have various moderation tools and everything to make sure that doesn't go too far in the wrong direction. So that's ambitious to do, and it's also it's the thing you do in the game after make sure you've gotten other things in the game right. But I think in the kind of platonic ideal of a good educational game, you'd always want to have that. We also have these kind of affinity spaces around the games, so that's the easiest thing to do, is just the sort of the online community that's sort of sharing their experiences. And then they're just the multiplayer, they're all the different versions of multiplayer. So we've focused on, because we had so much of a focus on the schools market, we did two things. One is everything that's almost all of the social things in the game are asynchronous, just because this one of the reasons is we want, because public schools, big audience, is our major customer. We didn't want to assume that kids either in school or out of school had pervasive access to connectivity. So almost everything in our games, except for some of the social features, you can do when you're offline, and then you sync back up when you're online, which is part of the reason we did everything as apps. So we don't have a lot of real-time social features, and that also makes it easier to do moderation. But we do have part of it is going back to this choice thing. Kids, I'm an introvert, and my son is an introvert, my daughter's an extrovert, and I can see the different ways that they kind of want to be social. And so giving kids meaningful choices about how they're social. I think pretty much every kid at that age wants to be social if they can find a way that's comfortable to do it, and to give them a bunch of choices to experiment is if you can do it, the best way to do it.
Hi, two quick questions. One, if you know when your players are playing the game, like whether in school or after school, and B, if can you measure if anything was actually learned?
Yeah, so two questions. It's been actually surprising to us some of the ways that they find time to play during the school day, because it just turns out that there's a lot of time when kids are in school, but they're not actually getting instruction from the teacher, or in some very formal. And the teachers in the school are actually very happy if you can work with them to figure out whether it's in the lunchtime. But often we've been surprised. A teacher is working with one group of kids and then needs to find something to do with the other group of kids, and you'd like to think they have some lesson plan and everything, but they're actually very happy if just kids take their tablet and pick a game to play. But the big blocks of time are summer is the huge one, especially. There's some great research that came out of MIT, and it's a little bit sad to talk about, but it's kind of worked in our advantage in the public school setting, which is that the poorer your family is, the more likely you are to take advantage of a free entertainment opportunity. Right? Which sort of makes sense. If you're wealthy and you have 5 consoles and an unlimited budget for free to play and all these things, then trying to get time is going to be harder. But if you don't have all those things and you have a tablet with 30 games loaded on them, and you can choose which ones to play, and there's 600 books. So for those kids, who are actually most of the kids in the United States, the blocks of time when they are not in school, or when we get just huge, just intense 6 or 7 hour play sessions or reading sessions. We have a virtual library that goes along with English language arts games. So we give them 600 books, and we discovered they would much rather read books on mobile devices than real books. We give them the real book, or you can read this on your cell phone. Thank you very much. I'd rather read it on my cell phone, and they're more likely to read it on their cell phone. In terms of learning outcomes, because we're early in this, and so much of our focus has been on can we get kids to do this stuff? Because if we can't get them to do it, it doesn't matter whether they would learn something from playing it. The outcomes are around kids reading for more hours per week of books at a certain level of text complexity, or spending more time in their own time doing challenging math problems or challenging science things. We haven't so far done the kind of outcomes research, because part of it is we're just really focused on trying to continue improvement. Those are expensive to do in a really rigorous way. It's like efficacy testing for pharmaceuticals. So I've kind of pushed off when to do that.
So my question actually is on this slide. I buy that in great games, failure adds content, but in learning games, when you have your player trying to learn something, if they fail, then it's probably because they don't understand something. And so adding content at that moment seems to be diverting them from the point.
Yeah, it doesn't, I mean, I don't think it quite works that way. You can have resource, I mean, because part of, I guess the way I put it is most kids are more comfortable with a learning where they're learning by exploring. So you want to give them ways that if they want to, they can explore, or by experimenting. And you want to give them the level design is really important. So like in 12 a Dozen, which is the math game, that is actually a game where there's not a lot of choice about the sequence of problems you do. There are 50 levels in the game. Each of the levels has 3 or 4 fairly complicated problems, and because it's linear, if you get stuck on one, you can't go to the next. And that's, not the ideal situation, but what we did was we have a rewind button. It's the thing on the lower left. So at any time, and it literally works like a cinematic rewind. Your character walks backwards and everything goes backwards and the screen goes until you get back to the beginning of that problem. And then you can just experiment with different strategies. So my own son, he started playing this when he was 7, and there were a bunch of math things that he hadn't learned to do in school yet that he pretty much taught himself. I wouldn't say the game taught them to him, but he sort of figured it out by playing the game and trying things. So I don't. Because and the other thing is actually, when I started this, one of the kind of chic things to talk about in education was this idea of flow, from the guy whose name I won't even try to pronounce, right? Yeah, that. And it turns out to be not exactly accurate, because it turned in the following sense, that actually people, including kids, find it intensely unpleasant to be at the optimal level of engagement for long periods of time. Like, you don't want to be at peak engagement for hours at a time. It's exhausting, right? What you actually want, and good game designers know this anyways, is this kind of ebb and flow where there are periods of intense engagement, there are periods of kind of just, again, the kind of hanging out or messing around. And so if someone is bumping up their heads up against a hard problem and can't solve it, allowing them to go and kind of do a side quest and do something else, which sort of reinforces their idea of efficacy and potency, and then going back and trying it again. It's like in the work world, I often find if I'm beating my head against some problem, sometimes just going for a walk and thinking for something else for 10 minutes and coming back to it. So games that allow that, but again, the choice, if you really want some help, this game does have a hint system, right? There's a wonderful narrator in the game, a British comedian named Lucy Montgomery. She's the dot that follows you around as the protagonist. So you click on that, she'll give you some sort of cheer, both encouragement and advice. But we gave this game to poor illiterate kids in rural India. There was a philanthropy that was interested in distributing it there. And so we had the hint system, but the hint system is in English. So these kids are both illiterate and don't know English. And so the philanthropy, they just gave the tablets to the kids and had them start playing the game, and they got it. right? And they were perfectly happy to persist. But again, an adult would be much quicker to say, but you have to give them supports. You have to give them all these things. Like, no, here's a 7-year-old kid from some, and they'll figure it. And then the social thing. If they can't figure it out, one of my favorite versions of social with tablets is the multiple kids around the same tablet. So you get 4 or 5 kids, one of them at the controls, everyone else offering advice. No, don't do that, do this, try this, oh no, yeah. And that's a learning community. And among those 5 kids, they're going to figure it out. One of them will figure it out, and then the rest of them will figure it out, or they'll figure it out together.
What's the name of this game?
12 a dozen?
12 a dozen?
12 a dozen. It's in the App Store for phones and tablets.
Are those free games?
No, so well, sometimes this is free, depends on what Apple's doing with it, but it's usually, I think, $2.99 or something like that. But it's 50 levels you get a lot of content for it. I won't pretend to know about how to monetize this stuff. That's
Justin, thank you very much. You're okay to talk to some people outside?
yeah,
There's probably some more questions.
Happy to talk.
All right, thank you very much.